Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all here. I'm David Leonhardt with the New York Times, and we are really excited to get into today's panel. I am joined on stage by Secretary Miguel Cardona, next to me.
Yes.
Former Commissioner of Education in Connecticut, and before that he was a principal and a fourth grade teacher. We were talking before we came on stage that when you need to take a quick break from work, it's easier to do that as Secretary of Education than as a fourth grade teacher. Yeah. Next to the Secretary is John Leguizamo. I'm sure many of you know him. He's an actor, comedian, and film producer. Recent projects include Leguizamo Does America. And opposite me on the stage is Dalila Wilson-Scott, Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at the Comcast Corporation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the President of the Comcast NBC Universal Foundation. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about the digital divide, and we're going to touch a bunch of stuff. And then after a bit, we're going to open it up to all of you, so I don't have a monopoly on the questions. So if you have stuff you want to ask, get ready to ask it. Secretary, I want to start with you.
Sure.
So we're talking about the digital divide. We've just gone through really nothing, something like that's nothing like anything we've gone through before in this country. We had kids out of school in many communities for an entire year. In some communities for more than a year, in some communities for less. And all the research I've seen suggests that kids were set very far back on average and that it widened divides. And so as we think about the digital divide, it's actually more challenging in many ways than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago. Can you talk to us about, as a country, how we're doing in making up for all that lost learning and lost social skills from the pandemic?
Well, yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. Happy to join the co-panelists here. Look forward to hearing your perspective as well. Look, before the pandemic, there were divides. There were digital divides, there were food divides, there were health divides, there were opportunity divides, outcome divides. The pandemic exacerbated it and brought attention to it. We are working really hard to try to make the digital divide something that is in our rearview mirror. I remember in Connecticut when the pandemic shut down schools, it was March 12th, 2020. The first thing we needed to do was give students meals. And then it was access to the device, technology. And I remember having a conversation with a superintendent of a very affluent district who said, you know, we have curriculum, we have devices, we have broadband in our community, we just flipped the switch. The kids are doing pretty well. Then I talked to a superintendent in another community where a lot of poverty, they didn't have the same resources. 4 weeks into the pandemic, they were still looking for kids. So that's what I mean by it made it worse. There are about 16 million students across the country right now that still don't have access. We are committed at the federal level to not only through the infrastructure plan, but through the, some of the American Rescue Plan dollars to make sure that every student has good broadband access and a device. A device and broadband is the new pencil, and we have to stop looking at it as like a privilege. It is access now. I've seen pockets of where it's working really well. Jemez Pueblo, a native country in New Mexico, has done a really good job making sure that students in that area have it. But we still have a ways to go, and I think, you know, for me, it's really about leveling the playing field. Not having access prevents students from accessing public education.
What specifically do we need to do over the next couple of years to help kids make up the ground they lost during the pandemic? Is it about summer school? Is it about longer hours in school? It seems to me that business as usual, even done well, isn't enough to make up for what we lost.
You know, one of the things we don't talk about enough is that the disruption of the pandemic gave us an opportunity to reimagine schools. And I always say, if we go back to what it was in 2019, we failed our kids. It wasn't working for everyone. So what I don't want to see, you know, we fought COVID for 2-3 years. Now we need to fight complacency to make sure students have after-school programs, year-round programming. anywhere, anytime learning. If you have a device and you can be connected to something, there should be learning regularly. I know a lot of high school students right now are doing Khan Academy in the summer months to make sure that they continue with their skill development. So for me, it's about making sure that we're not going back to what it was and giving them more opportunities, monitoring their growth or lack of growth, and really putting the resources that exist now to addressing those gaps that were there before the pandemic but were made worse during the pandemic.
John, how do you think about the pandemic and education?
Well, I think what he's saying is so important, closing that divide. But before we close that divide, we got to fix the content that the kids are learning, because that disparity is really dangerous. It causes so much Latino children at one time had the largest dropout rate in America, and it's improved since, because Latino children are the least seen in children's picture books. So it starts at a very young age. And then 87% of our important facts, Latino history contributions and heroes, 87% are missing in children's textbooks. And 13% of them that are in get less than 5 sentences. And what that does is, when I was a child, it made me sort of anti-education, made me not want to go to school, because I never saw myself. I never saw myself reflected positively. I only saw white people in my history textbooks, in my literature classes, math. Everybody who I was being taught was white, and none of my contributions. And we have massive amounts of contributions. That's my problem. I want those contributions, and I'm working to get a museum in D.C. I'm on the board for 10 years. Snap away. They've been at it for 40 years, and we got it through Congress, through the Senate. Both Republicans and Democrats went for it. I'm writing an encyclopedia with Scholastic. We just have to change that narrative. We have to put content in there. I know we're in a terrible time right now with the attacks on critical race theory, what people are doing in Florida, book banning, what a crazy thing to happen in America. But it's the content. The content is, before we get to that, getting everybody digitized, we need to have Latin content that represents the students. We're 30% of the public school students in America, and they need to see themselves.
Right.
Mr. Secretary, how much progress do you think we've made on those questions since we all were in school?
You're more likely to see a dog as a main character of a book than a Latino.
Yes. Truth.
We've normalized that. So we have a ways to go, and I would argue that in some places in our country, we're going backwards. There are some places in our country where the word equity is a swear word.
Right.
There are places in our country where leaders are being questioned or replaced if they fight for equity. So, I like Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's work, where she talked about books and curriculum being windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors.
Beautiful, so beautiful.
Right?
Yeah.
So, when you're reading something, it's a window into another culture, or a mirror. So, as John was saying, you see yourself as a protagonist. Or sliding glass doors, you have an opportunity to go visit another culture. That's the beauty of a diverse curriculum. I think we were better off 4 or 5 years ago than we were now. So, while we hear those who are trying to ban books or censor or overreach and stop what's happening in the classrooms, what we need to do is make sure that our offense is a little bit louder than that.
Right.
That we have to, use our leadership capital to push back against that.
Because, in Arizona, Latin history's been banned for 10 years because we're 30% of the population. And America's always had a fear of us. I mean, where are we? Colorado? This was once Mexico, and once before that was Native American. So, and all of west of Mississippi was Mexico. So there's always been sort of an antagonism towards Latin people, and our wanting to gain power, political power, and wealth, and it's been taken from us so many times over. I think the lack of oxygen made me lose my train of thought.
Dalila, one of your roles at Comcast is Chief Diversity Officer. The Secretary just mentioned this idea that equity in some parts of the country is a dirty word. How do you think we can persuade people who might be somewhat skeptical or at least agnostic about the value of diversity and equity, how do you think we can persuade people that it's right, it's important, it's not a threat, it's in their interest and the country's interest?
I mean, I think what a lot of people don't understand is equity is not just for some people, right? Equity, when you're doing it intentionally, when you're doing it well, benefits everybody. So we're talking about the digital divide. That clearly has created an opportunity divide. The digital divide is not a new issue. Comcast has been working on it, over 10 years. I think what's happening, though, is our worlds are increasingly digital, increasingly impacted by technology. They were just talking about content. We access most of our content digitally in many forms of society, right? So what does that mean? So people who are creating the content need digital skills to be able to create and distribute that content because most of it is happening through technology. 92% of every single job requires a digital skill set. That's not just tech jobs. It's not just help desk. You're a construction worker, you need a digital skill set, right? Blueprints are coming digitally, et cetera. And I think while our lives have just increasingly become digital, when the pandemic hit, it was apparent to everybody, even people who didn't think they were in a tech career. And I think if we don't recognize how increasingly digital the world has become, this opportunity divide will grow even greater. So I think equity is about thinking about the economic mobility of everybody in this country, our economic competitiveness as a country. I just think that's an important focus that we should all have. It's why we created Project Up. That's our $1 billion initiative to create a future of unlimited possibilities. We don't think this is just about connectivity. We don't think this is just about skills and creativity. We live in a digital economy, whether we like it or not. But we need to make sure everybody can be an active part of that.
One part of that digital economy is the idea of helping people learn remotely, right? And I know you've thought a lot about this. Just to spend another minute or so on the pandemic, given how important it's been for education. I think a lot of us as parents felt like virtual learning, distance learning, hybrid learning was disappointing, to be honest. And to be clear, if it was disappointing for people in this room, right, it was probably much, much more disappointing for people who didn't have access to basic computers and Wi-Fi. Why is it that it turns out that distance learning seems to be so hard, and how do you think about how we can do it better?
I think when you are distributing content digitally and you think about technology, it doesn't take the place of relationship and trust. Like if I didn't like you in real life, I like you even less digitally. So think about sort of a young, girl of color, boy of color in the classroom that didn't have a great relationship with their teacher to begin with. And now I have to, pay attention virtually. I already don't trust that person. The content may not be culturally relevant. I just think we have to recognize that bringing that technology skill set and distribution along with that trust matters. So I think some hybrid solutions have been effective. We work with an organization called Build during the pandemic. A lot of what they were doing with school districts across the country, they were able to hold captive those students and create some new critical thinking skills, teach them about entrepreneurship and ways that they were given opportunity and hope and people saw value in them, and something they weren't getting in their classrooms. So I think that hybrid approach, but starting with relationship, trust, understanding content, not imposing content, I think that matters. And I think distance learning itself doesn't take the place of humanity.
You know what, the Zoom and distance for creativity was really good for me and my artist friends, because during the COVID, we could do play readings. We did a whole Waiting for Godot. Somebody was in Israel, somebody was in LA, and we couldn't afford to fly everybody in, and we could access lots of people of color, young talent that was just being nurtured because Zoom made it equitable and made it fairer. And creatively, it worked. It wasn't the greatest at all. For comedy, it's the worst because, it dips out, drops, people don't laugh, so you feel like you're really the unfunniest person on earth. But for the dramas, it was better because you could see people's close-up. But I think that for the older crowd, it's much better than for the younger crowd, because for kids, digital learning is terrible.
I get the sense that a lot of people feel like there's a similarity between comedy and K through 12 education, in which neither of them work very well.
You read those textbooks,
Mr. Secretary, can you talk about?
When you're a teacher, you're on, man. You're on. You have to be entertaining, right? You're competing against TikTok and all that other stuff. Look, let's be fair, though. Our students and teachers had 24 hours to get it right? We went, one day we were in, the next day, I remember my own kids, right? And my kids, we have good access. We have parents that understand, use technology every day. And we had to switch like overnight, literally. And I think the capacity building for the organizations and the adults wasn't there. And it grew over time. It got better over time, but I think it'll never replace the human connection. Schools, learning, my kids, what they missed the most, I had 2 high schoolers at the time. They missed the sense of community. So you're never going to replace that. However, I think we'd be walking backwards if we didn't embrace how digital learning or blended learning can enhance opportunities for students. I remember talking to a young girl from Kansas who told me early on in 2020, I'm excited because now I could take classes being taught at a theater in New York with a teacher over there. Or I can take classes that are not offered in my school because we only have a limited amount of teachers that can teach certain AP courses. There's tremendous opportunity there. In fairness, we had to switch overnight. We have to continue to evolve our practices to make sure anywhere, anytime learning allows our students to benefit, as what he was saying in the theater space. Our students have access to learning in different ways now that we should take advantage of.
Yeah. Last pandemic question. I would love it if we go another 100 years before we have a terrible pandemic, but it seems like that's probably a bad way to plan for the future.
Right.
So I want to throw out what to me are 2 big lessons of this pandemic for schools and ask you to react and anyone else. So one is that teachers should have been a higher priority for vaccinations.
Teachers should be a higher priority, period.
Yes.
Period.
Yes.
And I think they really should have been a higher priority for vaccinations. I think we said it was healthcare workers, but actually we vaccinated a lot of executives at hospitals and pharmaceutical companies who weren't actually seeing any patients. In the state of Maryland, where I live, journalists were a priority category, right? To me, teachers should have been ahead of all of these categories. It should have been people over 65, frontline healthcare workers defined specifically, and teachers, and we didn't do that. And then related to that, I think schools were just closed way too long, even after vaccines were available. To me, those are the 2 lessons. Do you disagree with either of those? Do you have different lessons for the next pandemic?
Yeah, so, I agree on the teacher piece. I was sworn in March 2nd, 2021. Later in March, the President Biden announced we're going to move teachers up in the line. We went from 46% of our schools fully open when I took office, 46% fully open across the country. Within 8-9 months, we were over 95%. When you prioritize health and safety of educators, the issue of not opening schools, that goes away in the majority of places. Now, it's easy to, and I say this respectfully, Monday morning quarterback about how long schools were open. I had to sit on those calls with the epidemiologists who we were counting how many people died, how many teachers died, how many nurses died. There was no vaccine, there was no test. We didn't know this, what we know now. So in Connecticut, we were aggressive, but we were safe and aggressive. So one of the lessons learned in preparation, right? The term intentional collaboration is something that got us to reopen schools carefully and quickly in Connecticut, and quite frankly, got me on the president's radar. And it's now what we need to do to make sure we're meeting the demand of the careers that are available to our students. Intentional collaboration. 5 years ago, I didn't know what an epidemiologist did. They were on my speed dial in 2020. So we had to get out of our little silos, take off our blinders and work. I had to work with OSHA. I had to work with, so I think, lessons learned is, yes, we need to prioritize educators, and we need to think as schools as a part of a bigger picture. And we need to make sure how important, we recognize how important they are for our communities to grow. When schools shut down, communities shut down. That's the bottom line.
And just one great example of collaboration, Secretary Cardona has been a big supporter for Roy Ball Film and TV Academy in LA. We're proud to support, these getting more diverse talent into below the line jobs in media, and we're just excited about that. Hopefully we can take it to other cities, but having the weight of the administration behind that and just understanding that education can be effective and can contribute to our industry is huge.
Can you tell us some more specifics about that program?
Sure. I mean, Secretary, you should definitely weigh in here. I mean, Roy Ball is an awesome place.
Roy Ball is an example, is a school in LA, and thank you for the partnership there. This intentional collaboration, we need to, as I said before, get out of our silos. There are many below-the-line jobs in the film industry that we're not doing a good job connecting our high school students to. So Roy Ball Academy is like the example, and I want to shout out Sheethal Shah from my team over here, who's helped connect some of these dots. We have film industry partners who are on an advisory board that oversee the high school. So I visited Roy Ball recently in January. Don Cheadle was there. Mindy Kaling was there. George Clooney was there. Folks from NBC were there. Their unions were there. The superintendent were there to say, how do we work together to create pathways for careers for our students who are underrepresented in this field? If we're filming in LA, we should be hiring LA students. So this public-private partnership is an example of intentional collaboration that's working. And what we're trying to do now is take that message across the country. And I shouldn't be relying on the George Clooney's asking for money, because we have federal dollars that go into our schools to create pathways into careers that exist now. We need to be braiding the federal dollars, the state dollars, to make sure students have opportunities to serve in these below-the-line jobs that are available, high-paying, high-skilled jobs that they want, but they just don't know exist. So that intentional collaboration, that partnership, is opening doors for so many students. And thank you for bringing it up.
It's interesting because so often you hear that it's a pipeline issue, right? Which I think is often an excuse.
Yeah.
But it also gets at the idea that there are educational divides. How do you all think about the kind of the tension between that, right? Like the way you just described it, you could almost think, well, and maybe you'd think this, well, it's just a question of people not being aware of the opportunities out there. Mm-hmm. Right? But then we put that with the idea that there is a digital divide. And how do you kind of think about this? And this is for all of you. How do you think about this combination of, when you hear people say it's a pipeline issue, I really do think that's often an excuse. But I also think it's grounded in the real fact that we have educational inequality in our country, right?
Both. I mean, I was just on the Daily Show, and I was the first Latino host of the show in a city where Latin people are equal to white people, 35% to 35%, and they had never had a Latin writer, director, producer, actor, comedian, none of it, in a city that's full of that talent. And so I went to the executives and I talked to them, and they were very open, and I said, we got to fix this. This is very offensive to me to come into this workspace in a city that's, it's like living in a cultural apartheid. As you work in the New York Times, and I have a lot of beef with the New York Times as well, because it says New York Times, but the staff does this. How many Latinos there? We're 5 million people in that city. You can't find a couple of journalists to throw in there to tell our stories. I feel like it's living in a cultural apartheid. So anyway, I went to the HR, and they willingly, and like Cesar Conde, the chairman, he says he gets that all the time. He goes, you're incredible as chairman, but where are the rest of the Latinos who have talent? So he goes, look, and he pulls out his Rolodex. That's old school for contact list. And so I took a page from his book, and I went in there and I gave him a list of comedians, writers, producers, directors, and they reached out. And that's what I think we have to try to do. Is the talent is there. Some of it needs some help in boosting. They do, because of education discrepancies and all that. I mean, we have to create programs with their apprenticeships. And then you have to get funding, because apprenticeships don't pay, and Latin kids are usually in disadvantaged places that they can't afford to be paid $400 a week and survive. So you need that. And then shadowing is really incredible. We did a lot of that in my show, Leguizamo Does America. Can
you talk a little bit more about the show and kind of the staff of the show and just the huge success you've had with that?
So it took me 6 years pitching it to all networks, and I had a difficult time. And it wasn't the first time. I mean, I've been in this business for 4 decades. All right, 4 decades, 40 years, and I've been pitching all my life and not succeeding. And I thought I was a terrible writer, whatever, and then I would have success on Broadway and win, Tonys and Emmys and Obies, but I could never sell anything because it was Latin content, and no executive was going to greenlight Latin content. No matter how, if I wrote it like Shakespeare, if I acted like Brando, if I looked like Paul Newman, they still were not going to greenlight it because they had a Latin name, a Latin content. So here comes Cesar Conde, who looks like me, and I pitch him the story, and he gets it because, I only have 20 minutes to pitch, and I didn't have to download him 500 years of our history to tell him that, we're the largest ethnic group and the oldest ethnic group in America, that we're the only ethnic group that's fought in every single war America's ever had, that we're the most awarded in every war America's ever had, that we gave you chocolate, tomato sauce, spicy food, that we gave you the pen, that we gave you the artificial heart, that we gave you color TV, that we gave you the capture code, I'm sorry. I didn't have to do all that dance. He got me. And he saw the value of my show, and then boom, there we are. And then our mission was to fill it with Latinx talent, and we got 75% Afro-Latino, Indigenous Latino. My showrunner, this brilliant woman, Carolina Saavedra, she killed it, and she brought in younger writers that were less experienced because of the lack of opportunity. Because if you're not being chosen to work in certain fields, you're never going to have the opportunity. You're never going to get to that level that people are going to choose you. So she brought them up, and they rose to the occasion. Our DP was Puerto Rican. Our camera assist was Filipino. It was beautiful to see, and we killed in the numbers, and we brought quality. And I searched for Latin excellence across America, there's tons of it, and Latin exceptionalism. And now I get season 2. Thank you.
And the content has resonated with everybody. A lot of times, as underestimated, underrepresented communities, we have to go to a room and prove, that we need access to something, as opposed to think of how richer our country is because the contribution of underrepresented individuals and cultures. It sort of gives us an advantage that we don't have. So I think this asset-based framing and how we think about bringing communities into the broader culture so we all benefit is what matters, right? That show is not just resonating with Latino people, right? Like, he's award-winning, excited to do a second season. He'll be in 5 more cities celebrating Latino excellence because we're all a part of that.
Yeah. That resonates with me, because it's like, you always have to go above. You always have to prove, it's like, and in education is the same way. And it's really, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate publicly how important it is for you to take that position and do something with it to help others who can benefit from that. Because oftentimes in education, it's very similar, or you're the Latino Commissioner of Education. It's not like my doctorate has Latino in front of it. You know what I mean? I just happen to be, that's icing on the cake. You know what I mean? And that's why this asset mentality is something that we have to bring with us for the whole country.
Exactly.
This country is unique in that sense. I always say bilingualism and biculturalism is a superpower. If you can code switch and culture switch, you're at a different level. And I think we as a nation have to really, instead of defending, we need to be talking about how it's an asset and just look at it that way. Yeah. But I appreciate you taking the opportunities you have to lift up and reach your hand down and help others as well.
Thank you. I mean, I always felt like my success isn't just for me, it's for my whole people and all vulnerable people. I don't know, I guess I grew up in a really tough neighborhood, and I had a lot of fights. Well, let me correct it. I got beat up a lot. And,
they could both be true.
Unfortunately, it was. And so I have a huge sympathy for the vulnerable communities in America. And I feel like I can't stomach people being left out and marginalized.
Dalila, what do you think corporate America, perhaps including the New York Times, which John, as he mentioned, is criticized for not being more diverse, what do you think corporate America can do better in terms of specific strategies to embody some of these ideas that John was just talking about?
I mean, I think this conversation we just had about how we think about equity serving everybody as opposed to something extra I'm doing for somebody, I think is huge. when I think about Project Up, we were very intentional about the partners we selected, the leaders of the organizations. If you want to help address a social issue, you have to have proximity to that. You can't oppose a solution from the outside, and you have to recognize and amplify. We can't give voice to anybody, but we can amplify them on platforms that we have, and we should be proud to do that and want to do that. So I think just this notion of recognizing there's inherent value all over this country, we just need to find it and put it on different stages and make sure that we're recognizing it, I think is huge. So we have several of our partners here at Aspen with us. I know Brandon from Hidden Genius Project. I mean, these are people and leaders that I can trust, that I'm excited to work with, that teach me, that educate all of our corporate partners. We just have to think about equity as we all win when equity is done well.
So you've mentioned Project Up. That's $1 billion Comcast is spending to close the digital divide, correct?
Yes.
What are you building into that? First of all, tell us a little bit more about the specifics, if you would, and what kind of metrics and accountability are you building in so you can see what is actually succeeding, what isn't doing what we want, and how do we course correct as we roll out these programs?
And I do think that's a big part of philanthropy in general, is being willing to course correct. Sometimes as donors, we feel like we're taking these big bets, right? Like we're assuming there's all this inherent risk, hoping something will work and there's going to be this great outcome. But the truth is, like every other great innovation, you have to be learning and doing and switching gears as you do it. One thing, I just think this notion of making sure our partners and communities are centered in the work. The other thing I think that was important for us is making sure that people don't minimize what digital equity is about. It's not just about people getting connected. That's stage one. We can't ignore, we talked about the importance of humanity. We want to make sure that people from disadvantaged communities truly have a way to advance economic mobility. So it's not about being connected. It's, can I be successful? Can I acquire the right skills? Can I acquire the right creativity? As a founder, how do I think about being actively engaged in driving the digital economy? So I think you just have to be clear about what you're trying to achieve, and that outcome, as overwhelming and impossible people can make you feel, it seems, like being consistent, listening and centering community voices in that work is important. And thinking about, as a company, when I think of Comcast, we operate in media and technology, a powerful intersection that has changed so much in the past decade. Everything we learned through that work, we should be unlocking that potential for communities.
So last question for the Secretary, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. I was just asking about accountability in terms of Project Up. It feels like in education policy, the conversation has moved a little bit, right? Both Barack Obama, a Democrat, and George W. Bush, a Republican, were kind of very focused on accountability. They talked a lot about reform. They talked about the idea of we want to measure what kids are doing and reward and invest in the best ones and have consequences for the laggards in education. I think the Biden administration has taken a different approach very consciously, even if you would frame it differently. And I think there are certainly some people who are concerned that accountability in education is not as big a priority as it was 10 or 15 years ago. I'm guessing you disagree with that, and so I want to ask you how you think about accountability.
Sure. No, I think it's healthy to have these conversations at the board level. Look, I was a school principal during No Child Left Behind. I had to look at my little Latino students who were told, because of this subgroup, the school is labeled a failing school. I had to look at my bilingual education teachers in the face while they're crying. They're working twice as hard. They're feeding their kids, saying, your kids didn't make the grade. But don't worry, I'm proud of what you're doing. And you get a scarlet letter on your school. You don't lead with accountability. That's leadership 101. You lead with support, and you match the level of accountability. We can't lead with accountability, and it's kind of like the last administration saying, you better open your schools or you're not going to get federal dollars. That didn't work. That didn't work. Look, what you need to do is make sure you're investing in education, in educators, professional development, and yes, equal amounts of accountability. I don't shy away from the fact that one of the reasons why I got into this profession is because the achievement disparities really bothered me. Because I have to live my life as a counterexample. Whether I was in high school, college, that's unacceptable because all my cousins, all my friends I grew up with, they were just as bright as me. I was blessed to have opportunities. So I live that. In my mind, accountability is critical. But please don't lead with accountability. Lead with support, good research on what works, making sure students have what they need. It's easy to, and I come from Connecticut. You have Greenwich 10 minutes away from Bridgeport. Mm-hmm. Right? I talk to you about the districts that I talk to, they're not starting at a level playing field. So, Michael Fullen will tell you all day, you lead with support, then you match accountability. And that's my mentality.
What's an example of support? How are you all leading with support?
Professional development, look, resources to make sure, we tell teachers to be trauma-informed after the pandemic. A lot of kids lost parents, so we give them an hour of professional development. Now you're an expert in trauma. That's how we do business in education. Teachers have to budget their time to go use the bathroom. If I'm gonna have a conversation with you about how you're growing or how you're helping your kids, I have to do it after hours because I don't have time in the workday. Let's treat them like professionals. Let's make sure we're building their capacity. Let's make sure that we're holding them accountable for high standards if we provide the curriculum content that's high standards. A lot of times, I'm a big believer in fighting the ay bendito effect. You ever heard of the ay bendito effect? Ay bendito. Pobrecito, el nene, he went through so much. Let's just accept him behaving well. That's the worst thing we could do. I'm a big believer in high standards and good pedagogy and making sure we're connecting relationally with kids. That's education. So I struggle a little bit with those that want to come in not having spent the time as a student or an educator understanding what's happening in those communities, coming in with a prescription from the outside looking in.
What are the most important forms of accountability that we have today that you all are emphasizing?
Well, obviously, student engagement, right? Are students coming to school? Are they learning? Are they reaching high standards? Are they able to access happiness after school, whether that's college, career? Are we disaggregating those data and still, I think we've normalized in this country. I've used that word before, normalized. Dr. Pedro Noguera talks about a normalization of failure. Ever since we've been collecting data, Black and brown students have been 20, 30 points behind. We've normalized that. There was no urgency until the pandemic made us say, oh, wait a minute, it's getting even worse. Now we're talking about digital divide. It was there 5 years ago. So for me, accountability means our students have the same opportunities to lead successful lives, whether that's going to college, joining the workforce, contributing to their community, self-fulfillment, options. I graduated from a technical high school. I learned how to fix cars for 4 years. All right? Some would argue a Latino from a poor neighborhood, technical high school, he has no business going into teaching. I had a teacher tell me, hey, Miguel, consider teaching. I did, and I continued, and I was fortunate and blessed to do well. That shouldn't be a counterexample. So accountability to me means every kid in this country has an opportunity to follow their God-given talents and pursue their passions. That's what public education is to me.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I want to open it up to you all. I think we've got some microphones circulating. We've got a question right down here. I want to make sure I don't miss ones in the back, and we got a question right there. We'll start here and then right back here.
Hi,
Thank you.
My name's Lakshmi. I'm from India, and no, I cannot solve any technology problems you have. The two questions I have for you is based on that is, one is stereotypes. When you see someone, like Indian technology jobs, some other job, like it was very difficult for me to fight for a marketing job. So one is, how do you, at scale, fight stereotypes? And secondly, one of the things, we've been working in India for 20 years about digital divide. And the question people ask is, the poor kids need food on the table. Why are you wasting your time spending so much money talking to them? And this is not now. We're working on it since '99. They're like, why do you want to give them computers? How do you solve that thing of scale versus quantity versus quality of work we need to do? Stereotypes and quantity versus quality.
I'll hit up stereotypes since I'm in the entertainment business. And obviously, negative stereotypes are very damaging. And, it allowed Trump to call us criminals and drug dealers because what was on television? Narcos. What we were playing? Drug dealers. You know what I mean? So Hollywood had a culpability in that, always putting us in negative roles, and the rest of us trying to fight against that, trying to put as much positive content out there, because it does make the whole country see you. Movies are very important in our social culture. And it tells us how to behave. It tells us how to treat others. And that's something I've been battling my whole life. I mean, when I was growing up and I was in NYU, with my student loan, and I was in a class with D.B. Sweeney, a very successful white actor, and Andrew McCarthy, another very successful white actor. My opportunities were very slim. Even though I had A's, they didn't. I know that for a fact. But I was a better student. And I worked my ass off, and I got rid of my street sound, mostly. And they were going to 5 auditions a day. I was going to 1 every 5 months. And the breakdown, casting breakdown, was this thing about what roles are available, was like Jim Crow. It was like white actor, white lead, white doctor. And I would ask my agent, can you send me up for that? Let me just audition. Let me show them what I got. They wouldn't see me. And then 5 months later, I get 1 audition for a drug dealer, a killer, a servant, a gardener, and that's when my opportunity. So I knew I was a very idealistic young man. I believed there was meritocracy was everything, and then I realized that it wasn't, I was never going to have the same chances. So, that's something we have to fight so hard to make sure we have positive images of people of color, especially us Latino people who have been demonized in this country since the first film. D.W. Griffith portrayed us as the greasy, dangerous Mexicans in silent film since then. Even though they were taking our culture, we invented cowboy culture, and it was usurped, and they made us the villains in the movies.
And for your other question, I would say, for us, I think we always have to remember nothing we do, in fact, that's true for all of us, is working in isolation. So even though our commitment is to digital equity, which is about skills and, yes, devices needed for that, we're not going to sit there and ignore that there are other issues impacting, those young children, especially for people living in poverty. When we think about skills, and I talked about how many jobs in this country are required, I mean, one thing to be very clear about is when you're coming from a disadvantaged background, and we're sort of trying to make the decision of where to make our investments, I have to think about something that's going to make a difference economically for that family if I want that change to be sustainable. So it's not like, oh, should this child have food today or the best in technical skills? I should be trying to get both. So I think we just have to think about these solutions more comprehensively, and we may not be the best provider or partner for all those things, but we should be figuring out who is. But I don't think we should be making lesser choices for people who have lesser resources, and I think sometimes programs are built that way.
Right. And if I could just be brief on this so we can get to more questions. So to the stereotype question, we have to be unapologetically intentional about making sure that these counterexamples are lifted so that we break those stereotypes. Women in STEM, right? So we have to be intentional. Pay attention, the Supreme Court is going to make a decision in the next 48 hours around affirmative action. And that's either going to, continue what we're needing to do to make sure, as he said, that we're diversifying, or it's going to take us back decades in this country. So, that's my thing. We have to be intentional about it. And as you mentioned before, it benefits everyone, right? Not just a group of folks that you're supporting. And then to the second piece, I bring it back to the Ay Bendito effect. Yes, because this person needs a meal doesn't mean that they're not brilliant. And they can, they have the capacity to change the world. So we have to make sure that we're not lowering our standards because someone is further down on Maslow's pyramid. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi everyone. My name is Diego Mariscal. I work on supporting founders with disabilities. And it's really interesting to hear your backgrounds, right? Because I'm a Mexican-American, disabled, queer entrepreneur. And my question is around how do we make sure that those intersectionalities are well represented throughout the work? Because oftentimes when we talk about supporting underrepresented communities, it can be either focused on BIPOC or Latino or women, but I see it often not necessarily talking about how does these intersectionalities intertwine. So I would love to, from an educational standpoint, how are we thinking about supporting students and the people who we serve intersectionally?
Yeah. That's powerful. Thank you. It's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, all means all. All means all. And some of the challenges we're having now with some states is that they've identified a group of students that they want to pick on now. And this month it could be this group of students, next month it could be the next one. So I think it's important for us to understand the different challenges each of the groups have had, but at the end of the day, your message should be all means all. So it doesn't matter what backgrounds the students have. They should all have the same opportunities to benefit from what we offer. So I appreciate that for some students, they're fighting several different battles, and I respect that. And I think we also need to acknowledge that that's unique and that there are unique challenges and supports that are going to be needed for these students to continue to be successful. Thanks for sharing that.
And also just being intentional about understanding what the barriers are for the various intersectionalities that exist. There's no community that's monolithic. So all means I have to do different things for different people. Even just in what you do, supporting entrepreneurs, making sure that they have opportunities to access capital, grow their businesses. People don't always associate that with the accessibility, right? They think of assistive technology, right, as sort of like the meal versus the high-end tech skills. There's so much innovation, creativity in the community that needs to be recognized and celebrated, but not without full acknowledgement of the barriers that exist.
Katie.
Hi, everyone. Mr. Secretary, I'm so impressed. I'm so happy you're in your position.
Thank you.
I wanted to just raise the question that John did early in the panel, which is curricula becoming increasingly politicized and weaponized all over the country. And I'm curious if the Department of Education has the capacity to do some kind of overall guideline for best practices, not only when it comes to things like gender identity education, but also real history, not varnished, unvarnished history. Because what's happening in Florida and Virginia, I feel like teachers are really kind of caught in the middle. Is there anything you can do at the federal level to make this less of a state-by-state problem, or are localities just too powerful?
Sure. So thank you for that question. And
Great question.
I appreciate the ability to answer that because, to be very frank with you, prior to this role as Secretary of Education, as Commissioner, as Assistant Superintendent, as a school principal, I had more say in curriculum. At the federal level, maybe it was because of standards movements a decade ago, and the federal government doesn't. And I'm reminded of that by the Hill very regularly. But I'm an educator, I'm a dad. And I have the bully pulpit, and I have the power to convene, and I have the power to lift up best practices. And we do have repositories of, these are how folks are dealing with it. And we do have those conversations in those districts that are feeling attacked. So we do have convenings, and we also, with regard to grants, when we put out grant proposals, we put in there very specific expectations that promote curriculum that shows windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, right? So we share that, but I don't have, and the federal government doesn't have the authority to stop them, and it's a state-level issue. What we're seeing are major disparities between states. It's alarming, it's concerning, and that's why I said before, we need to not be on defense, but be on offense against that. So that's unfortunately, my control in that is limited. As a commissioner of education, I didn't want the federal government telling me what to do. I wouldn't want the last administration telling me what to do when I was commissioner in Connecticut. But I think what we're seeing now is less about education, more about polarization, more about trying to get your name on the national ticker so that you could get some points, political points, and it's also a very intentional disruption of public education to try to push vouchers.
So I'm going to ask you to use your bully pulpit. Katie specifically asked about gender identity. What are best practices around teaching about gender identity?
So one thing I didn't mention, Katie, the Office for Civil Rights has open investigations. Folks have asked us to investigate what they considered a hostile learning environment and a hostile work environment. So we do have the Office for Civil Rights to ensure that civil rights are being kept. So when it comes to gender identity, we have had cases brought to us for Office for Civil Rights. We have best practices. We have districts that are doing it well, that we're lifting up. And, you know, in education, we know students learn best from students, teachers learn best from teachers. So what we're doing is putting superintendents with superintendents. This is how you can navigate the space respectfully. And this is how you navigate maybe top-down leadership that's trying to censor you. It's a challenge. Our superintendents are struggling with it. We're also trying to build capacity of boards to understand what their role is to make sure that all students are seen and respected in the curriculum.
Thank you all. I believe we are out of time. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Oh.
Thank you, thank you. Awesome.